Okay, good morning again. We are going to get started with the presentation section of our session today. So this is being recorded and will be made available later through YouTube link. So we'll send that out to everyone with all the links to the presentations today once we're done. So in case you missed something or want to hear something again, it'll be there. So I'm going to introduce Jenifer Wightman now to you. I'm looking at her LinkedIn page. So she's a research associate at Cornell working on the sustainable bioenergy production and greenhouse gas inventories of forestry and agricultural systems. She teaches sustainable systems and biodesign at Parsons, the New School for Design. And she is also a conceptual artist interested in science, process, context, and the coevolution of ecosystems and society. And I've seen some of her work, and it's really it's beautiful. So if you get a chance to take a look, I would. So she's a very interesting person, has a lot of interesting things to share with us today. So with that, Jenifer, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. And I'm so happy to be here. I feel like I've been thinking of myself as a bumblebee across New York State. And today I feel like I want to share the good news about climate, because I think we really have turned the corner. So let's see. I want to give you a brief outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about the New York State greenhouse gas reduction law. And then I'm going to talk about the New York State greenhouse gas inventory. And then I'm only going to focus on two key mitigation strategies: manure management and growing trees on former ag land. There are, of course, other things to do, but I hope you see why focusing on these two areas might be of priority interest for soil and water conservation districts, extension, NRCS, local municipalities, and thinking about how to reduce local emissions with local resources and local people. So when I talk about the CLCPA, I really am just referring to the greenhouse gas law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the climate law. So if you hear me use that jingo, that's what we're referring to. So this is the Senate bill. So if you want to read the actual law, you can go to this QR code. But what does it say? Well, the high level content says that all sectors in New York State need to reduce greenhouse gases 40% by 2030. And this is below 1990 levels. The next goal is an 85% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And to be net neutral in 2050. That means for that remaining 15%, those hard to decarbonize things like jet fuel, or maybe even enteric cow emissions, we need to find some other resource, such as forest, to suck up the equivalent of that remaining 15% in order to become net neutral. It also mandates that any greenhouse gas mitigation strategies do not result in a net increase in co-pollutants. So we're not going to cause another problem, or at least not one that we know of at this point. It also mandates that what is implemented be implemented with a clear recognition of social justice. And one example of something that has been developed since this law is the Diversity and Racial Equity Working Group, which was released report, which was released in 2021 from New York State AGM, and it's quite enlightening, and I recommend everyone check it out. And that's just one of the many ways in which the law is embracing equity and social justice. It also has a mandate on costs. We need to minimize the costs, maximize the benefits, and encourage early action. So what do we mean by costs? Well, one of the ways that we're thinking about costs is New York State set a social cost of carbon on the cost for every metric ton that is emitted today and its cost to future generations in damages. And what they show is, or what they estimate, or what they choose for their estimate, is $130 per metric ton of CO2 equivalents. All right, so every ton that we can reduce today for less than $130 is saving future generations money and also strife and infrastructure lapses and things like that, right? And then, of course, as you can see, by 2050, the social cost of carbon is increasing, right? Because the game gets more and more serious the longer we take to reduce our emissions. The mandate also says that it will be legally enforceable, with the exception of agricultural emissions from livestock. And I believe this is one of the most beautiful things I think about this policy, is that it recognizes that our livestock are animals. And yes, the majority of their emissions come from their burps and their farts, but we are not regulating our own versions of that problem. And it's just very humane that we have made livestock an exemption. Right? They're amazing creatures that can turn cellulose that we can't digest into milk and meat products. And we're in a northern climate, and it's a great protein resource when you can't grow anything else in the north in the winter. It also has set some key terms that the greenhouse gas emissions reductions achieved are real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, and enforceable. I might take time to talk about these later, to be determined, but these seem like very simple terms, but in fact, they're super, super, super important terms to make sure that what we're doing is actually really mitigating and isn't just sort of, a shell game. So in summary, on the CLCPA, there's the goal is a 40% reduction by 2030, an 85% reduction by 2050. We have a scoping plan, and it is to be revised every 5 years. The mitigation must be low cost. It must be equitable both to current generations and future generations, not cause other sources of pollution, and must be measurable, real, permanent, and verifiable. And 2024 is when the regulation goes into effect for all sectors. So for example, in New York City, apartment buildings have energy grades right now. My apartment building has a grade of B, but I believe anything that has a D or an F will have its first fines in 2025. If it doesn't choose to invest in making their building more energy efficient, then there are fines which then go to support other projects. But that's just one regulation for one sector. If you think New York is unusual, it's not true. There are loads of states with similar types of goal setting, and it's really exciting. Okay, so we have goals, but how do we actually reduce our emissions? Well, the first thing we need to do is we have to gather a baseline of what our current emissions are. And so here is the historic New York State greenhouse gas emission profile from 1990 to 2020, right? You can see 1990 over here and 2020. And what you should know is that in 2020, New York State emitted 345 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So MMT, carbon dioxide equivalent. All right, so that's what we emitted. But you should know also that our 2020 emissions were 15% lower than our 1990 emissions, right? So if you look at, this is where we are in 2020, and this is 1990, that's 15% lower. Hooray, we have a 15% reduction on our 2030 goal. Are you encouraged? Did you even feel the impact of it? Now, energy is the majority of our emissions. It's the blue part, and it's everywhere, and it's fossil fuels, right? Waste is also a meaningful player. Agriculture contributes 6% of our emissions, and forestry is a net sink, removing emissions. It's negative, right? It's falling below the line here. And so this black line represents everything above minus the forest carbon sequestration below. So this black line is our current net emissions. So where do we need to go? Well, this is where we need to go. This is roughly where the 40% is, and this is where the 85% is, okay? And we've got until 2050 to get to this, right? So don't panic, and we're already here. Plus, the New York State submitted its first scoping plan in 2020. It's 445 pages long, but you can use the index and get to the section you want to see the ideation of a massive stakeholder group. I mean, it was really impressive how many people participated in this and the ideas that were generated. And this gets updated in 5 years. So, right, I mean, as we develop new ideas, the scoping plan changes. But here is basically our emissions profile. And what I want you to notice is that most of our emissions, right, are coming from our buildings and from our transportation sector, right? More than half of our emissions. You'll see that natural gas for our electricity generation is almost equivalent to our waste emissions. You'll also notice that all of our renewables are not on here because they're not emitting. And in fact, in 2022, 30% of New York State electricity is already renewables, and the goal for 2030 is to be 70% renewables. But we're well on the way for that objective. So here's a summary of just the inventory. Most emissions are for buildings and transportation. Agricultural emissions are small. Waste emissions are similar to fossil-based electric emissions. Forests are a major carbon sink. We are already 15% below 1990 levels. So how do we rally for the next 25% to meet our 2030 goal of a 40% reduction? So how do we reduce our emissions? And now I'm just going to focus on agriculture. Well, what we need to think about specifically in agriculture is that while society at large needs to think about carbon dioxide from the combustion of fossil fuel, agriculture needs to think about 3 different interacting gases: carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O. And that's because carbon dioxide has a different potency in the atmosphere than methane and nitrous oxide. And according to DEC's choice on the global warming potential, methane is 84 times as potent as carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is 264 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So it's not that agriculture is producing such large quantities of methane and nitrous oxide. That's not the case at all. It's that these gases have a large potency to impact climate. So a small amount of N2O released has a large impact on the total farm GHG budget. So for example, if you emit 1 pound of nitrous oxide, that's equivalent to emitting 264 pounds of carbon dioxide. So you can start to see that as you're thinking about increasing soil carbon, you have to think about how that impacts the nitrogen relationships and how that might impact N2O emissions, right? When we do this conversion, when we move from one type of gas, CO2, CH4, or N2O, into multiplying it by these factors, we end up with what is called a CO2 equivalent, or CO2e. So when you see this E, that means this multiplication by this factor has occurred and everything is in the same unit. So just to get some perspective, here's the US emission sources. And you'll see that most of the emissions nationally are carbon dioxide, and they come from energy, right? It's all fossil fuel. You'll see this tiny little piece right here is agriculture, and it's roughly 10% of our emissions. Now, if we bring out that red piece of the pie, the 10% from agriculture, and we look at it for the components or the sectors within agriculture that are causing these emissions, nationally, you'll see that agricultural soil management, which really means nitrous oxide emissions, is off the charts, right? Like it's way over here. It's 345, and this chart only goes to 200. The next 2 important sources are enteric fermentation methane and manure management methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And what these guys, these are all small sources of carbon dioxide nationally from agriculture. But the point here is methane and nitrous oxide are the key sources of greenhouse gases on farmland. So here are the draft results for New York State. This is work that Peter Woodbury and I have been doing for the state. I'm going to skip these numbers and show you these summary slides, which shows that enteric fermentation is the largest source of emissions, and it's 61% of our total emissions, and that's literally the microbes that are collaborating with the cows to break down that cellulose in their rumen. It's a really unique ecosystem, and it's really amazing. 29% comes from manure storage methane, and 2% comes from manure storage nitrous oxide. So these two are counted together. Agricultural soils in New York State are only 6%. We're a high livestock state, so it changes compared to the national. And then soil organic carbon emits 2% across the state, and urea and lime emissions are roughly 1%. So if we look at our emissions in agriculture only, almost 90% are from methane and 8% are from nitrous oxide. Now, we also have to remember that forests on farms are not counted here. They're counted in the forest sector, and energy on farms is not counted here. It's counted in the energy sector. But if we think about the energy, we estimate it's maybe 3% addition to the CO2 section. So if we compare national and state emissions, US ag emissions are 10% of our total emissions. In New York State, ag accounts for only 6% of our emissions. Nationally, ag emissions are dominated by nitrous oxide. So there's almost a billion acres of ag land, and they're all using nitrogen, whereas New York State is dominated by livestock. So we are dominated by methane. We're the fourth largest dairy producer. But generally, this means that if you're working with a livestock farmer, focus on the methane. And if you're working with a crop farmer, focus on nitrous oxide. Okay, so here is the inventory from 1990 to 2020 for just agriculture. And I'm just going to quickly go through emissions by activity. 61% of emissions are from livestock enteric fermentation. Huge, right? But what we should know is if we look at the gray triangles, this is the herd size in 1990. We had like 760,000 cows. And now we have something like 625,000 cows. But look at their milk production. Our cows have been doing amazing things. Fewer cows and greater milk production. And so if these cows from 1990 were producing 2020 milk, the emissions would be off the charts. And so even though there has been an 11% increase from our dairy herd, the herd population has decreased 18% and our milk production has increased 37%. The dairy herd is incredibly efficient. It makes sense because feed efficiency, the more effective you are at converting that food into milk product, as opposed to the byproducts of methane, means less feed in and more milk out and greater cost savings. It's very difficult to mitigate much further because we have some really great farmers in the state. And remember that livestock is the single exemption in the CLCPA. However, it still counts to our total 2050 goal, right? We got to be net neutral in 2050. So whatever we aren't able to address in the livestock sector, we have to find other ways to sequester the equivalent amount of emissions. So again, if you are working with a livestock farmer, be sure to help them think seriously about how to manage their forest resources, right? For example. Okay, 31% of our total ag emissions come from manure storage. And this is a combination of what's in blue, which is the methane from the manure storage, and what's in blue and green striped, which is the manure nitrous oxide emissions. There's been, so if you compare between 1990 over here to 2020, there's been like a 275% increase in manure methane. Why? Because in the mid-1990s, we had these great water quality initiatives, and those drove liquid manure storage so that manure was not applied on top of the snow in the wintertime, so that it didn't melt off into our waterways. But basically, when you make a manure storage, you're basically recreating the anaerobic conditions inside of the rumen. So what is a manure storage? It's this earthen storage that has all the cow foodstuffs, has all of the cow microbes, And it gets really anaerobic. So it's just like the cow rumen, and it's producing large amounts of greenhouse gases from an ag perspective, small amounts of methane from a state perspective. And so this is just to show you a chart, right? The triangles here, or diamonds here, are the annual compliance report for liquid storages in the state, okay? And what you see down here in the open diamonds are the New York State Ag non-point build out of new liquid storages. So the new storages are, of course, in the same trend as the annual compliance report for storages. So that explains why there's been an increase. 6% of our emissions come from nitrous oxide. We use all kinds of forms of nitrogen on our soils to grow our crops, and it's been pretty consistent, and it's a really important thing. But what this means is everything we do to protect water quality both can save money for the farm because you reduce the nitrogen inputs, and it will also protect water quality. So this is a really synergistic relationship between water quality and climate change. It's a great opportunity. People have been working hard on this all along. I'll skip that. 2% of our emissions come from our soils, which is a combination of farm practices, land use change, and soil type. So this is the red section of the chart. And what is included in this number is not just the type of farm practices such as row cropping and perennial hay, but the tillage practices of no-till or conventional tillage, plus any kind of carbon inputs like manure or residue, cover crops, sewage, anything that you're adding, which is a carbon source. It also includes any land use changes between forest, cropland, grassland, wetlands, settlements, and other. And it also recognizes the difference between mineral soils, which is the majority of our soils, right? 3.4 million acres, and our histosols, which are really drained peatlands or wetlands, which are a huge source of carbon emissions. And what needs to be made apparent here is that the impact among ag-only soils is really from our histosols. Our small amount of histosols dwarfs everything, including tillage, cover crop amendments, and land use change. When you think about land use change, conversion to agriculture decreases soil carbon. That's just a general trend, a logical process. And conversion from agriculture to forest increases soil, right? So when you have these different directions, you have different impacts. It's all common sense to you all. Okay, 1% of emissions come from lime use and urea. I'm not even going to bother talking about them. So the summary of our emissions. So if we add up all of those sectors, it's 22.4 million metric tons of emissions. Now, there are other emissions. We estimate about 2 million metric tons come from energy use on farm. But of course, that's counted under the CLCPA in the energy sector, so we're not double counting. And so if we're just thinking about ag in general, it's about 24 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And that's our internal estimate. Now, if we think about this 22.4 million relative to New York State's total of 376 million metric tons, agriculture is accounting for just 6% of our state emissions, compared to, say, energy, which is 77% of our emissions. Okay, all right. We're also missing in this accounting any carbon sequestration from our woodlands. And that's because that's counted in the forest sector. And we should recognize that 20% of agricultural land is considered wooded. And so that is an incredible resource farms have currently. And we recommend that you all really support the same kind of stewardship farms have for all other practices to apply to their woodlands. But of course, woodlands are often very profitable and most people are managing them well. Okay, take-home messages from the inventory. Ag emissions are a small fraction of total New York State emissions, only 6%. Most ag emissions in New York State are from livestock, and it's a combination of enteric plus manure management. For cropping systems, most emissions are nitrous oxide. So if you're working with a cropping farm, really try to hone down on that nitrogen use. Soil carbon changes are a very small fraction of emissions, and most of them are from histosols, which is a tiny fraction of our total area. And some ag-related emissions are counted elsewhere, such as farm energy use, upstream fertilizer manufacturing, as well as the carbon sequestration in our forest systems. Okay, there's some key terms in the CLCPA, and I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about them. And those are these terms: real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, and enforceable. And again, these sound very simple, and forgive me for being pedantic, but actually it's what puts the boundaries on our accounting. So, we're not defrauding each other, right? We're using our taxpayer money to do real good to impact emissions reductions. So real, what do I mean by real? The quantified greenhouse gas reduction must represent actual emission reduction. So did you count do you have a baseline so that you can see if your change in practice went up and down from that baseline? Did you count your net greenhouse gases? Did you only count the carbon sequestration, or did you also evaluate the nitrous oxide and the methane? Did you sample sufficiently? Did you game the system by taking stuff away from one area and putting it in another area and only accounting there? There are a lot of components to what makes a real mitigation strategy real. But the point is, real mitigation quantitatively reduces our total emissions. So that whole inventory, we can start seeing meaningful reductions. It is a real reduction to help stop climate change. A great tool for thinking about this is a tool by my colleague Peter Woodbury called FastGHG. And just to make this point, here's an example of no-till resulting in net greenhouse gas emissions reduced, a reduction on farms. So everything to the right implies a reduction. Anything to the left of the line implies an emission. And you can see here the sum, the green sum. This practice results in 0.1 megagrams of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. But a non-legume cover crop can increase net greenhouse gas emissions. So all I'm trying to get at here is that we need to think about multiple things as we're thinking about mitigation. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't want a cover crop just because of greenhouse gases. Like, you want a cover crop for all kinds of water management, nutrient management, or soil management, right? So, but just let's help each other make a distinction between when we're rigorously trying to address a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy and when we're trying to work towards resiliency. And the state has all kinds of resources for soil health and resiliency, but let's not overstate the benefit from carbon sequestration from soils. And the reason I say this is that, comparing a ton of carbon sequestered in soil that may, if you've got the best farm managers stay there for 30 years, is not equal to a ton of fossil fuel CO2 emissions that have been sequestered for millions of years. Everything we can do to keep that fossil fuel down in the ground is going to help us. So we want it to be permanent. And here's a playful example on what I mean by permanent. So climate change is a problem of hundreds of years. Is a mitigation practice permanent, or is it reversible? And on what time scale is it reversible? How much does it actually help us make real change to our baseline emissions? So here's my silly example. Imagine a bottle pop of soda. A Pennsylvania company seals some CO2 into a can of soda. Me, a New Yorker, purchases that bottle, and I open that CO2, and I open that soda, and it releases the CO2 in New York State. That is both temporary and reversible storage. Does Pennsylvania in their accounting system get to count a reduction? Does New York State count an emission? My point here, playfully, is to address how accounting is really important. And there are 3 points here. There's a boundary of accounting, New York versus Pennsylvania accounting metrics, the reversibility of the carbon sequestration of the CO2 in the soda pop, and then the time scale of the permanence. Is this real mitigation? I would argue this is neither real nor permanent mitigation. I'm going to skip that. Quantifiable. Can the mitigation be sufficiently detected and measured? Did you gather a baseline? How frequently are you measuring? Are you doing it annually for soils? Are you measuring both the carbon and the nitrous oxide? Are you doing decadally for trees, or just a few measurements once in a while? The number of measurements to track the change, how often, how many? Did you use the same test, the same location, right? The point is that we need to be rigorous in how we measure so that we're not misleading ourselves. Verifiable. The greenhouse gas reduction must result from practices whose performance can be readily and accurately quantified, monitored, and verified. Well, this can be expensive, right? You have expenses of implementing a project, and then you have expenses in verifying the project. And then you have the liability. And do you hire a verifier? And do they have insurance? Now, there are ways to short circuit verifiability if we put into place systems that maximize verification and minimize the amount of field work to verify. Because fundamentally, verification comes down to who is held accountable. And if we're really trying to reduce our emissions, this is a very important part, but it can be expensive. So we need to design things that make verifiability much more easy to do and much more rigorous. So remember our goal. Our goal is to reduce the total greenhouse gases. We can use these terms to ensure that we're providing a long-term solution to the climate crisis. To make a real difference on the climate, we need a baseline. We need to count all three greenhouse gases together. And these greenhouse gas reductions should be real, permanent, and verifiable to ensure society is meaningfully achieving climate stabilization with our tax dollars. So Peter and I have evaluated a range of 13 different greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. I'm not going to go into all 13, but we looked at dairy systems, crop systems, woodlands, activating idle lands, and conservation. These are the 13 practices that we did in our 2020 report. And in order to evaluate them, we designed a smart decision matrix to evaluate multiple criteria. And this smart decision matrix has 5 components. Does it provide services or co-benefits? Does the greenhouse gas mitigation improve air quality? Does it also improve water quality? Does it improve community relations? Those kinds of things. Does it save money? How measurable is the greenhouse gases? And how large is that greenhouse gas mitigation potential? Is it a lot of mitigation with only a few farms engaged, or is it a small amount of mitigation overall? How much does it cost to achieve this greenhouse gas mitigation? How realistic is it to implement? Is the technology available? Do we have the staff available? Do we have the resources to? Does it involve a zillion people? Does it involve 5 people? And what is the time frame of implementation? How long does the infrastructure last for? Does it get us through a timeline? And how long is the greenhouse gas mitigation? Is it a temporary mitigation, or is it a long-term mitigation? I'm not going to go through all of this, but the point is we went through the SMART matrix and we evaluated those 13 strategies on the previous slide. And we chose the top 5 based on the lowest cost. They either saved money or were up to $75 per metric ton mitigated. Most were under $10 per metric ton, represented real and permanent mitigation. Most can be directly verified, some are indirectly. They have a suite of wonderful co-benefits that make it smart to do anyways, and many increase production efficiency of New York State agriculture. And these were our top 5. Improving livestock feed management. They're already doing a great job, but there's room. Manure cover and flare, how to put on a cover and simply flare the methane to destroy it. Nitrogen use efficiency, save money, use less nitrogen, improve water quality. Improved management of our woodlands existing, and planting trees on a fraction of our idle lands. And so on the left here, you'll see our emissions total that you saw before. And here are estimates for practices under $25 per metric ton. And with these 3 practices, we estimate almost 7 million metric tons reduction in our current emissions. That's a 30% reduction. If we add in afforestation, so we estimate that there are roughly 4 million acres in New York State that is idle or underutilized. If we just grew trees on 1.7 million acres, there is the possibility for 5 million metric tons to be sequestered in that tree stem per year. So combined, these 4 practices result in nearly 12 million metric tons, or roughly half of our current emissions. So I'm going to skip this. I just want to make a point that, of course, there are lots of other things you can do. There's cost savings, ways of looking at this: livestock feed efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency, energy efficiency on farms, building out infrastructure on existing infrastructure such as solar, activating these idle lands, not just for afforestation, thinking about how those can be used for solar, or those could be used to expand forage production and increase imports of perhaps grains from out of state. And then, of course, all kinds of energy efficiency for all of us. Okay, I'm now going to focus on 2 mitigation strategies that I think we should really try to work hard on. Manure storage, right? Let's think about how we can reduce the methane from manure storage. This is just a function of our water quality initiatives, but there are all kinds of opportunities through the Climate Resilient Farming Program. Agnon Point allows, the funding for Agnon Point allows it. The NRCS CSP 367 roofs and covers allows a cover and flare. And when I say cover and flare, what do I mean? I mean, literally, this is a manure storage with a plastic cover. You can't see the flare in this image. This is Table Rock Farm, and this is their cover and flare system. So what we're focusing on here is this emission and this mitigation potential. So and this is at less than $20 per metric ton of greenhouse gases, right? That's the estimate. There's a large mitigation opportunity. It can reduce 4.3 million metric tons, possibly. It is a low cost per metric ton. There's a relatively small stakeholder group to engage. There are several co-benefits: community relations on odor, community relations on weight load on local roads, hauling costs to the farmer, time for hauling for the farmer, water quality benefits, right? Because it's not allowing the rainwater to cause an overflow event. Also, an ability to use the separated solids as bedding to reduce costs and reduce solids hauling, as well as some farms are thinking about moving away from sand bedding and all of the imported emissions and effort and costs from managing the sand and applying the sand. Existing programming exists through CRF. Many have already implemented, so there's farmer-to-farmer communication. There are, of course, barriers. There's an upfront cost to farmers. It requires engineering to retrofit. There are many pieces to sequence, right? Like, it isn't just the cover and flare. You got to think about separation. You got to think about a storage for the separated solids. You got to think about how much management you're willing to do if you're going to use the solids for bedding, or if you're going to package the solids for sale as high quality compost to a local community. And plus, you have to deal with the liquid cover and flare, et cetera. If milk pricing goes down, it might be hard to participate. It requires technical assistance, but there's new awareness, there's new policy, there's new funding, and we can think about, instead of building new storages without a cover and flare, all new storages that we build, we design with a cover and flare. And this is allowable under Agnon Point. So we're not making that farm that's taking on a new storage system increasing its emissions, nor are we adding to the emissions to New York State's total. And we're doing it. So soil and water conservation districts are doing it. So in Western New York, there's one in Livingston. In the Finger Lakes, there are 4. or 5. In the eastern region, there's 1. In the northern region, there is 3. In downstate, there's 1. So there's not tons. There are some people in each region doing it, and there are all these resources to support it. And if you average the cost per metric ton from the last 6 rounds of climate resilient farming, you'll see that the cost per metric ton destroyed is under $20 a metric ton. So there are lots of considerations. I'm going to skip this for time, but I just want to show you, right? You need collection pits. You need solid separation. You need to compost. You need to get that bedding up to 160 degrees, or that the solids up to 160 degrees to kill the microbes. You can sell the bedding. You can use it you can sell it as compost. You can use the bedding. But also some farms are taking the liquids and using it for irrigation to deal with times of drought. Here is a storage ready to receive a cover. And here's a trench being built around and filled with concrete. Here's a bird's eye view showing the different kinds of components that need to be considered. Here is a pump that pumps off the clean rainwater. So that can be distributed somewhere more useful or safer. You need to have a flare or some kind of system to protect the flame from wind, but you also need to have an emergency vent in case something goes wrong, right? You need to allow the gas an escape hatch. You need to have some kind of a battery source or a solar panel or electric line in order to make sure that the flare is working, right? You need a sensor to detect that the gas is flowing through, and you need a sensor to detect that the flare is hot, indicating that the methane has been combusted. The point here is that this uses flow sensors and temperature sensors and an automated reporting system to ensure that there's real permanent, measurable, and verifiable destruction of methane. Do we need to improve on this? Of course we need to improve on this, but the point is, this is something we can totally do. If you want to watch a 20-minute webinar, consider this presentation by Jess Skinner, who presented for us 2 years ago, as well as Dale Stein's discussion about his experience separating, using the solids for bedding, and using the liquids for irrigation. Remember, every new storage we build to protect water quality adds more methane to the state and farm's greenhouse gas budget. So we also need to be thinking about what kinds of storage systems we want to produce in the future to both protect our water quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't necessarily mean that cover and flare is the answer in 2050, but cover and flare is a very good answer on some farms today. I'm going to switch to the next topic, which is long-lived carbon sequestration. And I want to give you some context. In the 1850s, almost all of our energy consumption in the United States was from wood. We discovered fossil fuels in the late 1800s, and you can see how those fossil fuels are now the majority source of our energy consumption. Now, this is 1850. If you look at the changes in New York State forest land, we were almost entirely forested in the 1600s, but by the 1850s, we were almost entirely deforested. We are now about 60% a forest, but this is very important for meeting the net neutral goal of 2050. And what we're talking about is how we get this remaining 15% down. And the idea is that we're going to expand this green section below zero by improving forest management and perhaps by thinking about afforestation. And this is a recent report that has been recently published by our group working with the Nature Conservancy. It was really led by Nature Conservancy, but we helped, showing sites for potential afforestation on post-agricultural lands by county. Now, of course, there are other considerations like birds and solar panels and habitats, various habitats landowners want. But this is a map to help us think about where we might think about working on afforestation projects. And that's the point here, is to get at this additional 5 million metric ton potential of just afforestation on 1.7 of the estimated 4 million acres of land in New York State. And we think that this can be done for less than $75 per metric ton. What's really great about this is that it produces long-lived wood products, right? The trees grow for 100 years. 100 years from now, future generations say, hurrah, they harvest those trees for furniture or building materials. They open up the canopy so that the forest can continue to sequester for new trees, but then those trees live for 100 or 200 years in the buildings that future generations grow. So this is increased profitability of former ag land that is not currently active. But we have to think about other competing opportunities. Should we be using this land for solar, wind, bioenergy, grazing, new products, habitat? There are, of course, barriers for activating these lands for afforestation. There are existing deer. We've never had so many deer, and they happen to love some of our best tree species. There are all kinds of pests and invasive shrubs. There's diverse ownership desires. There are parcels all over the state. They have varying soil quality and slope. There are different landowner interests and goals. There's upfront costs to activate the land use change. There's technical assistance. There's seed selection. There's lots of possibilities and lots of unknowns. But the point is, this is a very constructive use of 1.7 million acres. It also improves water quality, improves resilience to climate, improves habitat for animals and recreation, and it's active carbon sequestration with 100+ years worth of growth. And it helps us meet our 2050 goals. And can displace concrete and steel, which are very energy intensive and high greenhouse gas emitting building materials, while producing increased economic products for future landowners and generations. So, do we have the resources to help the landowners and homeowners make these kinds of changes? Well, federal funding this year alone for NRCS EQIP was 13 million, plus the Inflation Reduction Act added 20 million. And supposedly it's going to be even more in 2025. Plus the Inflation Reduction Act has all kinds of money for other kinds of projects like home energy efficiency and car efficiency. I haven't even put any of that in here. But then we have a whole suite of state resources. There's the climate resilient farming, which can be used for small forest projects like riparian buffers and for cover and flare and feed efficiency. There's the Climate Smart Commodities Grant, which a bunch of different people work together to get $10 million for applied agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation through the CRF program, and $10 million for the Growing Reforest New York program, and that's going to be allocated over the next 3 years. Plus, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative brings in funds. There are line item funds. Plus, you, I, and everybody else voted in the 2020 ballot for the Bond Act. So there's $4.2 billion, all about how we think about the next generation of infrastructure for the state, and that's to be determined, but that's also funds coming along. My point for highlighting these two projects is that manure cover and flare and afforestation basically address roughly 10 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. They have huge co-benefits. The afforestation is a great gift to future generations, and we can do it. It's going to take work. Of course, it's going to take work. Everything meaningful always takes work. And maybe there's some better ideas out there. I am not precluding those other ideas. I'm just saying that these are two good ideas we can do today, and we should start thinking about doing them. A summary on ag mitigation, and then I'm going to stop. Enteric emissions are exempted from regulation, but they still count to our total state emissions. So we still want to work on feed efficiency, but we also want to think about our concomitant forest resources on a dairy farm or livestock farm. There are market mechanisms to reduce inputs and associated greenhouse gases. So feed efficiency is one of those cost-effective choices. Which also reduces the crop area that's needed, which then reduces the fertilizers needed on that crop area. Improved nitrogen use efficiency is cost effective and helps water quality. Plus, it reduces upstream emissions from producing those synthetic fertilizers. Emissions from manure management can be reduced at low cost with cover and flare. We can also explore renewable energy options. We should also be exploring how to engage idle and underutilized land. We have 4 million acres. And how often do we think, oh, I need to help a farmer, or, oh, I need to help a forest owner. But how often do we think about, oh, I need to work with somebody who has idle land? Chances are we should be thinking about how we can engage that part of the population. How to explore forest management of existing forests, how to think about mixing our livestock with our forests through silvopasture, right? There's all kinds of opportunities there. And best management practices are always good ideas for all kinds of reasons, even if it is not for greenhouse gas mitigation. I also want us to stress, right? We are 61% forested, and we need to really think about helping those landowners. We're 20% agriculture, 13% idle lands. We've got water bodies and coastlines we need to be thinking about, urban and rural cities and towns, and of course, our buildings and infrastructure. How will we engage these regions for the highest and best use for each other? Remember, fossil fuels are the key problem. And every drop we do not bring up to the surface, we do not add to the atmosphere, keeps us from having to manage and pull it back out of the atmosphere. We are incredibly inefficient, and that's great news, because this is something we can fix and reap all kinds of benefits besides greenhouse gas. We can save money, we can improve the environment, we can have social and health benefits. We've already addressed 15% of our emissions. And did any of you really feel it? How can we think about engaging this without fear and with hope? Mitigation is the best adaptation strategy because it slows the rate of change for all species, all farmers, and future generations. And we need to think about how to help non-farmers stabilize the climate for farmers. So how do we help each other reduce our energy? Can we help a low-income farmer retrofit their energy inefficient home or low-income family? Can we help a renter get an energy efficient refrigerator, or a neighbor get solar on the roof, or get an idle landowner to put a 5-acre solar array? That's it. Thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions.
Okay, everyone. Thanks, Jenifer. We do have some time here, and you have this incredible resource here right in front of you to answer questions. So I would say you could also just have, some comments or, whatever for Jenifer to respond to. So this is your opportunity to do that. It looks like Mary, I'm not sure if that's the old one or the new one, but if you raised your hand, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a new one. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, Jenifer, about thinking about whether for idle land, whether it's going into solar or forest, kind of those benefits to each of them, because, thinking about if it's turned into a forest land, not only you're helping protect the soil and you're giving habitats, and you also have that carbon sequestration. So is there a greater benefit in looking to do that rather than solar, and maybe putting solar more towards like on the top of houses, or using those offsets of like maybe you getting an electric lawnmower, or, having that other area and using that idle land primarily to be back in forest?
I think you're thinking all great thoughts, Mary. Like every direction that you're thinking is great. And the wonderful thing is I don't think we have to say either or, right? We have to think how do we think about our local community and what is our local problem? So for example, rooftop solar in New York City makes loads of sense, right? Because there's a huge load there. And so in that case, every solar panel we get on top of New York City buildings, we don't lose any electricity through the grid coming all the way from St. Lawrence County, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And the energy is produced locally. And chances are the the amount of energy that's used in New York City in the summertime when it's hottest is going to be the highest when the solar panels are great, right? So we have to think locally, right? What is the problem? New York City has brownouts. When do we use the most electricity? We use it in the summertime. Are solar panels on the roof in New York City make sense? Yes. Do solar panels on the roof in New York City reduce the need for solar panels upstate? Yes. Do we want to do that? I would argue we do want to do that. But then we also need to think in the flip side. We also know that putting a little bit of solar panel on a lot of different roofs with a lot of different landowners has an opportunity cost comparison and an engagement requirement that a project on a brownfield upstate that has a large scale solar panel project that is really close to existing grid infrastructure makes perfect sense, right? And then you get a huge array. You have this, you can set up battery systems, right? So I'm just trying to give that example. Are you going to grow trees on a brownfield? No. Are you going to grow crops on a brownfield? No. Do we need more solar than our brownfields? Yes. So then let's think about that idle land that you're talking about. And let's think about, well, is there grid already close to that idle land in order for there to be a solar array? Or is there a short distance for the grid to be connected there? If there's not, let's think about how we could build out forages to take on our nutrients that maybe are too much on existing dairy land ownership, right? So that the nutrients get spread out and grow forage crops there, right? If it's good quality land, let's keep it in good production. If it's got slopes and rocks and it's not good for agriculture, let's think about reforesting that. So because trees will do great in that situation. They might have a slower startup, but they will have an important impact. And ultimately, this comes down, we're a home rule state. And it comes down to what communities want and need and how they want to plan. And so I don't think it's an either or situation. I think it's what do we need in our local community? And let's remember we've got a suite of choices to choose from, and then let's think and plan accordingly. Does that sort of, I think we're not going to need that much land for solar. And it's crazy. Some people are cutting down trees in order to put solar panels in. It's crazy that anybody's putting solar on even current agricultural land, in my opinion, right? It's happening because the grid is close by. It's happening because we have retiring farmers. There's all kinds of things. We could think about how we can take that land from retiring farmers, buy it and help young farmers take on that land, right? There's so many things to think about here. And of course, there's all kinds of incentives that are driving certain behaviors. But we as a community, as we really wrestle with this, we're going to make better decisions. And I just encourage us all to sort of step away from like either or and step into what's my context, and let's have a community discussion about what we need and how to get there and what we want to prioritize.
Lost my mouse for a second there. But no, I really appreciate that and your response there. And I'm just curious about making those like well thought out and thorough decisions. Like, how does that either compete with the deadlines that we have to reach those marks by 2030 and 2050, and also compete with maybe that financial incentive from a solar company to put that on that land versus, what you would actually get in it from being a forested area. And so I'm just curious about like, battling that aspect of what the landowner is really going to get out of that land if they choose either option.
Well, I'll just say that I think the solar incentives are pretty enticing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the solar incentives, remember, we're not going to need that much area for the solar that we need. So even if agricultural land, and I am stepping aside from my passion, right? I personally don't want to see solar, me personally, I don't want to see solar on ag land. I consider that precious. It's been stewarded for years. That soil carbon has been there because we've had hundreds of years of farmers working that land to make it whatever quality it currently is, because it was stone and tree, and that is really hard to remove once you've got it, right? So I don't wish to see solar on that land, but it happens to be that incentives, grid lines, and retiring populations, it actually makes sense for those farms to make those decisions. And I don't want to stop that farm from making that decision for themselves, right? That's their decision. Ultimately, the incentives today are to get the fossil fuel emissions down. And if we put solar panels on that ag land and 30 years later, we rip out those solar panels and we return it to ag land, right? We can do that, right? So let's try not to get paralyzed. I get paralyzed, right? Let's not try not to get paralyzed in thinking that once we turn it into solar, it can't be anything else. It can't be forest. Or once we turn it into forest, it can't be something else, except I don't know, the last time you tried to pull out a tree stump, it's really, really hard. So I would hope wherever we plant trees is a place that we never want to change, right? That doesn't mean you can't harvest it. It just means you're not going to have to pull out those tree stumps in order to put agriculture there. So I think, I don't know, I think the incentives for solar are going to outweigh the incentives to forest. But the good news is that we've got all kinds of landowners and they all want to do different kinds of things. And so for somebody who wants to grow forest, it'll be a great idea. But we also have to think about what kinds of seeds we want to grow because the climate's going to change. So we also need to think about building up the seedlings, right? We have to think about our pests. It's not a done deal, but it's something that we can do thoughtfully. And actually, the diversity of responses by different landowners is going to be resilient, right? Landowner A wants to monocrop pine trees and landowner B wants to make this complex thing from South Carolina, right? And somebody else wants to do just a maple grove, right? I mean, some of those are going to win out and some of them are going to lose out. And then we have to re-up our decision-making when we figure that out.
No, yeah, and I really liked what you had mentioned there about like that sort of flexibility within solar within like 30 years or 40 years, like we can always change that or go back to something different if that, however it works out, or maybe we find another way to harness that energy in a more efficient solar panel, or how as research and development comes. So yeah, thank you. That definitely answers both my questions there.
I want to add one complexity. The CLCPA requires us to count the upstream greenhouse gas emissions from our fossil fuels, right? So wherever those fossil fuels are mined and wherever they're processed, we have to count them as our emissions in New York State. The CLCPA does not count upstream emissions from imported food. And one of the things we're not really talking about is that if we transition our food system to our energy system, we're basically causing the greenhouse gas emissions from our food system to move to other states. And so we do import a huge amount of our food. And that's something that is missing in this accounting structure in the way that it is not missing for the fossil fuels, right? We are being responsible for our imported fossil fuels, but we are not being responsible for imported foods. And if we reduce our agricultural production, meaning we use that land for forests, or we use that to sequester carbon, or we use that land for solar panels to reduce our fossil fuels, we are now requiring Pennsylvania to increase their emissions for producing our equivalent food that we need to now import. And so that's an interesting, in my mind, miss in this accounting structure. And I'm getting really complex here, but you're asking really juicy questions. So I'm pushing this concept here. But whenever, even if the potato yield is only getting $100 an acre a year, those are potatoes that are made here, paying for farm labor who live here and supply our food system, right? So potatoes versus greenhouse gas from fossil fuels displacement, right? When we've got 4 million acres of idle land, we've got all these rooftops, like, that's my personal position, but it's just a complexity for the accounting.
No, and I think that's really important to bring up too, because like as much as we are trying to meet these goals to use that idle land for one thing, as you said, if we're still going to continue importing these goods, and there's that demand for those specific goods. And as we get, I don't know, I think comfortable with what is available in our markets and stuff, that if we're not always taking that into account, then we're just increasing those emissions or pushing those emissions off to another state that's surrounding us. So I think that's really important, because then it shows how interconnected everything is as we're trying to meet this one goal, but we're not really looking at this other aspect and, where that could be improved.
Any other questions, pushback, other ideas, wishes, hopes, fears?
We
So-
did have, oh,
Go ahead, Aaron.
Go ahead, Sean.
I was going to say the same thing, that there was a comment in the chat. I'm happy to read it if you'd
Oh,
like.
please, please,
It's a little long, yeah. There are always unintended consequences, often negative, from the implementation of government policies. You gave a good example in manure storages and methane. Those in the private sector are often the first to perceive these consequences, and likely the more impartial judge, because they are not vested in the development of the policy. Unfortunately, there appears to be very little effort by state agencies to utilize those experiences. It is understandable why politicians wouldn't want to identify the negative impacts of their policies. It's more disappointing that university and agency people seem hesitant to make an objective evaluation of the impacts of incentives.
So Sean, what do you like? Can we focus on a concrete example? I'm not disagreeing with you. We always need to think about it. I will say that our water quality initiatives did not anticipate or were not concerned about climate change at that point, right? Like my brother always says, for good or for bad, is like, we're all on a monopoly board. It's a terrible example. Can't believe I'm using it. And we just keep going around. You pass go and you have a new round, right? And so I would argue that the water quality initiative was, we were aware we had a water quality problem. A bunch of people came together and that was their solution. Then we became aware that actually it's now producing greenhouse gases. Well, actually, a cover and flare system is kind of a great way of conserving the nitrogen in an anaerobic storage for liquids that could be spread in a different kind of way in the bedding to displace sand bedding, right? There's like lots of good things that might come out of this as a holistic system, but we just have to pivot in order to incorporate this new awareness that we have grown. And so I guess what I would like to hear from you is, what is an example of the private sector perceiving a consequence? Like, what's an example that you would like me to know about so that we can think about designing something that averts what you're perceiving? Because
I'll forward that question to the commenter, who was D Stewart, and if they'd like to
okay,
unmute. They did write that you gave a good example with solar policy.
Yes,
But if you
I
have
agree.
anything else to add, feel free to unmute. And
I just want to offer that the people that I work with, we're all looking for pragmatic solutions. And so really what we're here together trying to do is we're trying to connect the dots between each of our roles and skill sets. And so I would just like to encourage everybody to say these comments more and give examples of what you want to see change so that we can start having the conversation to design the solutions. I don't actually think the solar policies are fundamentally bad. They're just particularly, there's a panic because we haven't dealt with this for so long. We've put off this policy for so long. I would actually argue the lack of policy for so long is really the problem here, because now we've got these major goals that we have to attain. And it's actually a small area that we need for solar. It's just, we really need to work on our grid. I think our real hang up in the state is we all need to have hard and thoughtful discussions about how to make our grid better. And that is going to be very much connected to how we use our land use. But I just want to encourage more conversation and less feeling left out. Like, we all need to talk and we all need to cross fertilize in order to come up with designs that are useful, and nothing's ever going to be perfect. I don't know, Dee. Contact me.
Yeah,
Let's
no,
put
this is Dan. This is Dan here. So an example would be, there's been, like, on different permits and actually on the climate scoping plan, they've put it out for a lot of comment, for comments, a lot of these policies. People take a lot of time to put together comments on it, and it doesn't seem like government agencies actually really respond specifically to any of those comments. And again, as a I work as a KFO planner and crop advisor, and it often seems like we're not being heard, or there's like not even any avenue to give you feedback on the unintended consequences that we're actually seeing out in the field. It just doesn't seem like there's a lot of discourse. And I'm not saying you particularly, I'm just saying in general, that's the way we often feel. It's the way I feel. I won't speak for everybody. It's the way I feel.
So when you're helping as a crop planner and a KFO manager, when you're helping those farms and then working with the soil and water conservation districts and NRCS to implement projects, aren't you able to help them design ways to use what you know about a good farm system to avert some of these problems, or to connect the dots on some of these problems? Or are you saying that when you pass off the plan to the farmer and the soil water conservation district, those things are not getting implemented in the holistic way in which you wish or had imagined that they could work together to avert those things on the ground?
Well, I think it's more like within the framework of maybe how things are prioritized or ranked on the projects. It doesn't always seem like it's the best use of our resources. Like, again, we're all have limited resources, and sometimes what you see actually happening out in the field with those resources not great. I can give you an example there, and this is more with NYSERDA. There was it's actually PON 2149, Solar Thermal Incentive Program. And that was basically to preheat water to go into washing systems on milk houses. With the farms I've worked with, there's probably a couple dozen that did it. And, I would say on that couple dozen, if there's one or two that were actually functional, it would be a lot. So basically the businesses, the incentive gave the funding for installers to install them, but there was no incentive for the farmer or for the people who installed it and received the funding to actually make it work. And I see that quite often with different projects, and there's no avenues to even get that feedback, to the state. And if we can't look at where, things are not quite going right, if there's no incentive to do that, then how are we going to improve our programs? I'm just encouraging you to, to reach out to some of your, your private people out there who actually, working directly with farmers and aren't vested, in, like in the agencies or in the, the programs that were put out there, to see, hey, what's actually really happening.
Let's have a conversation afterwards, right? Next week. Like, this is the point. This is why I'm here. And I'm like one tiny little cog in the piece, right? Like, I'm one tiny piece of the puzzle. I'm not a policymaker. I'm a researcher, and I'm interested in hearing these complexities in order to help think about what can happen. But I also know that when we design something, it doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, right? Like all kinds of things go wrong all the time. We just have to keep playing. And
Well, I'm not putting that out there at you specifically. I'm opening that up more for discussion. Hopefully, I can't believe I'm the only one who's seen, you know, these different things.
I think
Thank you, Dan. It looks like we have a hand raised by Scott.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I would stand with the previous speaker in saying that a bottom-up approach, one that takes in the input of the folks on the ground, is and should be kind of final to the way we do conservation. It is meant to be a bottom-up process, relying on the practitioner. But beyond that, Jenifer, I'm encouraged about the reduction in emissions from New York. I didn't realize that, and that's really kind of cool to see that on the graph. And you described yourself in the beginning as a bumblebee flying around the state and talking to all these different people, and obviously your work reflects a ton of research, and I can only imagine the number of contacts and comments. But so I'm just curious. I know we're running out of time, and you've got a full day ahead. But if you could create a short wish list of one or two things that would maybe remove what you see as the biggest, easiest, low-hanging fruit in terms of challenges or positive steps. The flip side of that, a positive development in both your key areas of covers and flares and afforestation. You share with the group. I mean, we all come at it with a different perspective and different sort of roles within our professions, but your talk has really been terrific. And I think in a way, everything to the same talk kind of in a way aligns us. And so I wonder if you could offer just a couple of suggestions as to what we could do perhaps in our own small way to remove barriers or take a positive turn. Thank you.
So it's so open-ended, Scott. It's just gonna come.
That's my style.
I will just say, in the 1800s, we had a cholera outbreak. Why did we have a cholera outbreak in New York City? Well, because we had people who collected night soil every night, went crisscross, cross Manhattan, dumped it into the East River, went the other direction, dumped it into the Hudson River, went the other direction, dumped it into the East River, right? Horse and carriage. Because we weren't managing our sewage. And notably, our first sewage treatment plant was born in New York State in the town of Flushing, which I think is really funny. And that's how we addressed the cholera outbreak, right? We had a sewage problem because we weren't managing our sewage. And then, we had a whole rural electrification movement in the 1930s in order to get electricity to farms and for clean drinking water. I mean, past generations did that for us. We built out roads. I remember driving to New Jersey to see my grandma once a year from New Hampshire, 8 hours of driving, and we had to navigate, and I was maybe 10, and you look at the map, and on the map, there are the roads that we could take. And then there were roads that were in process of being built or planned to be built. And I think we need to have an attitude of what America has always had, which is this can-do spirit of like, how can I think across, we have all of this information about how we relate to our ecosystem. So how can we each embolden and empower ourselves to take the knowledge that we have gained in our generation to build the infrastructure for the next generation. And I think cover and flare is really simple. And I hope to goodness we're not talking about it in 2040, because we've come up with better ideas by 2040 on how to manage our manure. Afforestation, on the other hand, like in my mind, that is a gift to future generations. That is such a gift to future generations, both in habitat for species diversity, water quality, materials to be used, as well as increasing the areas that allow natural succession to happen, so that as the climate does change, different forest species are able to grow in and succeed the others in response to a changing climate. So to me, these things are you know, they're if it's a good idea on a particular farm, like, let's just get on it, right? When the cookie jar is out of cookies, let's make some more cookies. When the compost bin is too full, let's take it out. When the roof is leaking, let's put a bucket underneath it and save our money and figure out how to fix the roof, right? Like, to me, they're just pragmatic. They're just the next generation of the way in which we're trying to bring our awareness and our reflexivity and our growing knowledge to build a system that is responsive to the ecosystem that hosts us all. I don't know, I went way off, but Scott, you gave me the open-ended questions. It's your fault.
Thank you, Jenifer. I like, I'm optimistic if the challenges are, a matter of motivation and common sense decision making, and kind of a work ethic that says, let's get after it and start doing these things when the opportunity is there. That we can do. So that's good stuff.
And let's argue, right? Let's contest. Like, it doesn't have to be blindly. I totally agree with Dan that we need to have better call and response, but also that takes people. And I can tell you from what I've seen of the DEC, there are relatively few people, and what they are being asked to do and manage right now is mind-blowing. I'm struggling managing all the things I'm asked to do. Like, we need more people on this topic, and we need, this is our citizenry, and I think community discussion is key to how a local community decides. And that's what's so great about soil and water conservation districts. You're a little mini government agency, basically doing call and response with your local municipalities on what is needed, and how can you use those resources to make those complicated decisions that are locally responsive. And I think that's what's so exciting about soil and water conservation districts. You're the people who are doing the work, and you're doing site-specific work. And I'm so grateful you're out there. I now look at culverts and riparian buffers, and I recognize like a lot of people work together on just those two projects, right? And there's a zillion of those projects across the state, and we have a whole history of that. So I don't know. It's awesome. I think it's really neat that you work with ag and markets to do these things. And NRCS. Anyways, I got to stop. Thank you so much. And feel free to contact me if you want to help innovate some ideas. I'm an idea generator.
You are. Thank you very much, Jenifer. And yeah, thanks again for this discussion. This is one time where I think being in person would have been made this a lot better, but we did the best we can here. And just one thing I will say about engaging other agents and other non-governmental agencies that is tough is, you mentioned, Jenifer, everyone's time is maxed out, especially within agencies, I would say. But asking like a private consultant to take the time, because like I get paid to go to the meetings. I have a grant, it gives me money or whatever. When I was working for the soil and water districts, we had funding to go to meetings, and but a lot of consultants in private industry, they don't get paid for that. They get paid to work with the farms and generate plans and all that stuff. So it's hard to ask for their time. So I think that's one reason sometimes why those groups don't get included, is because they can't. They have to build their time to something, and what are they going to build to that they sat in a meeting that so it's a tough balance to get everyone involved, or asking a farmer to show up. Again, they don't get paid to sit there, and no one's taking care of the farm while they're gone, or they have to pay somebody to take care of it. So Yeah, it's just, there's no easy solution to it. Otherwise we'd be doing it for sure. Because we all, I think, on this chat here want what's best for the earth and our health and a healthy society. So we're doing our best. But with that, I am going to, so I thank you very much, Jenifer. That was very informative. You went on for a long time for a good reason, and I appreciate that energy and time that you put into this. So with that, Blake is going to join us in about 5 minutes. So I'm just going to take a 5-minute break here and give my voice a rest, even though it's already been arrested, it's struggling here. So we'll be back at 11:15 to hear from Blake. So thanks, everyone.